All right. Hello, everybody, and happy whatever time of day is appropriate for your time zone. Um, and welcome to the Tuesday, April 25th meeting of the Gateway API Gamma Initiative. As always, Kubernetes Code of Conduct rules are in effect, so please treat each other respectfully. And with that, we can get going. It looks like there might be a few new folks here today. If you want to take a moment to introduce yourselves, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, Bonnie, and you're muted.
Classic. Hi, everyone. My name is Bhavani. I'm based here in Amsterdam. I work at Miro, which is a collaborative digital whiteboard app, and interested in all things API gateway related. Yeah.
We have actually, we have used at one point. There was a Miro board that was capturing a lot of hideous and horrible things about Gamma.
Oh, great.
Used Gamma to do Miro, and Miro can use.
Exactly.
There you go.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, I'll go next. I'm Nico Vibert. I work at Isovalent with Nick Young, and I'm in the technical marketing team, creating content about Gateway API, and yeah, looking forward to learning more and about Gamma.
Well, since Nick isn't here, we'll expect you to pass on the mockery because he's not here.
Glad to have you.
Cheers.
All right. I think everybody else is a familiar face in the call. Yeah.
I'll echo Thomas's comment from the chat that adding your name to the meeting notes would be wonderful.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, the meeting agenda and notes are linked in the invite. Yeah, please feel free to add your name and company, so we can keep track of who is able to join these calls. And yeah, we have alternating time zones. So you may notice that today's meeting is 8 a.m. Pacific time. It's intended to be an EU friendly time. On alternating weeks, we have a 3 p.m. Pacific time, which is intended to be a little bit more friendly for those West Coast folks. So yeah, I guess we don't have a whole heck of a lot on our agenda for today, given that we canceled last week's for KubeCon. A handful of us were there in person. But I feel like it may be useful to kind of briefly recap any kind of discussions that we had during KubeCon. Do you want to start that off then, if you're deep in that headspace already?
A lot of the stuff that I'm writing was not entirely about Gamma, but that's okay.
That's fair.
Okay, so
summarize. I can also cover a few points as well.
At the Kubernetes, well, I missed the first half of the Kubernetes Contributor Summit because I was off at Linkerd Day, but I did show up for the Gateway API session that Shane did, and the Gamma gathering, which technically I was listed as the moderator, but there wasn't exactly a lot of moderating that happened in that, since it was mostly just getting people together to meet up face to face and say hi. That plus some other stuff from talks and conversations at KubeCon and things like that, I think could be summarized as, I feel like people are very much interested in hard answers about what's going on with Gateway API and Gamma. And I feel like there are not a lot of hard answers to be had yet, because every time you start trying to use these things in anger, you run headlong into the extension mechanism question and things like that. If anybody else feels differently there, I would love to hear it. I have also been pointed at a couple of talks that I was not able to attend that people said I should go ahead and pick up on the video. There was one in particular that I'm kind of interested in, where they were apparently using Gateway API as an API for developers and using something like policy attachments to provide templates at the gateway or gateway class level to go through and instantiate other objects based on HTTP routes, which is actually really
I was in
interesting.
that.
You say again?
Yeah, I was in that session. It was
What'd you think of it?
interesting to see a very like creative and unconventional use of the API. So
Yeah, and that's why I kind of wanted to go check that out. I wanted to look at it as an example of potentially a case where people just went ahead and used it anyway. And I was kind of curious to see what they ended up with, right? Another thing that was interesting to me is a topic that has come up a few times in this meeting and elsewhere, which boils down to, yeah, you know, who are we building this for anyway? I have always tended to come to the cloud native world from the perspective of an applications developer. And there are clearly others who come in from the perspective more of a cluster provider or a sysadmin type. And it's really interesting to walk around KubeCon, look at the booths, listen to people talking, and realize that this seems to be very much an open question in the community of who do we really think should be the person that this stuff targets? I personally still tend to believe that it should be possible to use Kube and service messengers and Ingress controllers without requiring an army of SREs to take care of everything. But it's interesting to see the extent to which that still also seems to be a very open question. Finally, I think I would point out that at the Gamma gathering, there was some discussion of Gateway API 0.8. What did it mean if we were talking about having Gamma being a part of Gateway API 0.8? And in fact, what does it mean if Gateway API is going to try to get to 1.0 by the time Chicago rolls around? In particular, given the commentary about hard answers, I kind of left KubeCon wondering how realistic that 1.0 goal really is and what we might need to do to get to 1.0 of Gateway API, and certainly what we might need to do with respect to Gamma if we want to have something that's basically usable by Chicago. There you go. That's my stream of consciousness brain dump. I would be happy to hear other opinions, commentary, heckling. Okay, maybe not so happy to hear heckling, but I'll certainly willing to accept it from anybody else who has thoughts.
Hey, Flynn, is there an issue that kind of captures that point that you're making around what would be needed to have Gamma ready in time for 1.0 or Chicago?
Yeah, I don't actually know. It's on my list to look for, but I don't know. Mike, Keith, does one of y'all just happen to remember off the top of your head by any chance?
Sorry, the 1.0 for Gateway API?
Is there an umbrella issue for things?
There's a milestone.
Well, okay, yeah. So that might be, so Daniel, we can probably look at the milestone and get a sense there of what people think might be needed.
Well, and let me clarify too. Like, I'd figure there'd be a Gateway API milestone. What I'm getting at is like specifically for Gamma, if that is kind of a target, is there an issue that's specific to Gamma of saying, hey, let's start capturing the things that are needed for having Gamma ready for Gateway API 1.0.
So Keith in the chat linked milestone 9, which is Gamma HTTP route support ready for implementers to try, which is not quite necessarily the same as things we must have ready for 1.0 or GA or whatever you want to call it, but it is certainly, that is 100% necessary, although possibly not sufficient thing.
Yeah, I think that kind of piggybacking off of that, I think that we have to get Gamma to the point where we can get real user feedback
Yeah.
before I at least feel comfortable talking about the Gamma GEPs in general being ready for a 1.0 or like a stable or GA. Like when it comes to where Gateway API goes, when it comes to versioning and what a 1.0 means, in my mind, that is it's helpful and I think almost necessary to think about that as being distinct for Gamma's maturity. You know, 1.0 represents a lot for Gateway API and the resources and the code that live within Gateway API. Because Gamma as of yet does not own any code or resources, that version doesn't really mean much for us at this time. If that were to change, then we'd have to have that conversation and feel like and be more, I think, specific about what the graduation process looks like. But everything, all the GEPs that Gamma has at the moment are experimental or provisional. No, provisional specifically in the experimental channel. I think I get it mixed up with what terms refer to what things. But the maturity and support models within Gateway API are more indicative of the maturity. Well, we do have conformance tests. Sorry, we do have conformance tests. Thank you.
Shane is right about that.
Yeah, Shane's correct about that. Yeah, go ahead, Flynn.
For the record, I pretty much agree with you with respect to the fact that Gateway API 1.0 was orthogonal from Gamma maturity. If anybody disagrees with that, I think that would be a lovely conversation that we should have, but that's how I've kind of been thinking about it. When I was initially talking about Gateway API 1.0 before Chicago, that was, I was trying to say that was aggressive in the sense that I'm not sure Gateway API will have all the answers they need to really get to a 1.0 before Chicago, as opposed to Gamma being, focusing on the Gamma piece of that.
I don't think that we're I don't think that we're expecting Gamma to be like GA or stable channel by Chicago. I think the immediate goal is getting Gamma past completing that milestone for Gamma becoming ready for implementers. And graduating the GEPs to the experimental channel. That is kind of like the near-term goal for Gamma, to get to a point where we can start having implementations available and start getting user feedback. Because as we saw with Gateway API, there was definitely a substantial period where user feedback informed some of the API design, and the experimental channel was just that. It's for figuring out what works, and what is actually going to make sense to move forward and is subject to some change potentially. So I don't think stable GA is a near-term goal for Gamma.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to, I agree with Keith too. I'm gonna have to go and look up, okay, wait a minute. Are we saying this is implementable in the experimental channel? There's feel like there's 3 different dimensions of how we talk about this now. So I got to go look that up.
I'm not personally, I think we need to change the experimental channel to something like staging in name.
I actually think you should keep it experimental, because I feel like if you were to change its name to stable or staging or beta or something like that, then you might get people too afraid to change things that are experimental. I don't know. It's an interesting thought.
Well, we've traditionally used it that way. But it's something that Rob and I have talked about at some length, but I don't know, maybe just, if nothing else, put the bug in your brain that is kind of how experimental has been used in the past.
See, that actually kind of worries me in some ways, because that suddenly makes me much more concerned about the design of things that we're adding to experimental, and how it feels more important to get them right in some indefinable fashion, as opposed to getting to something that we can get feedback on.
Yep, me too, and that's kind of why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, Gamma in particular has a really, really nasty chicken and egg problem where we need the feedback to be able to get, make sure we're doing the right thing, but we're not going to get the feedback as long as people think that we can just change it out from under them constantly. So it's a weird thing.
It's not really a good parallel because of the difference in scope and stuff, but recently added a prototyping phase to the GEP phases specifically to deal with that problem with conformance tests. However,
Yeah.
the damage with conformance tests, of course, is so much less. There's so much less potential for damage. So it's not really a great comparison, but just to put that bug in your head that like, it may be reasonable to expand. I know we don't want to have to change process to do everything, but it may be reasonable to do that for Gamma.
Yeah. Also, for the record, I just want to acknowledge that I have a couple of pieces of writing that I owe Shane in particular. So y'all can be my witness that I'm going to get that stuff to Shane this week.
Well, we got one we got to work on together too.
Yeah, we do. Go to KubeCon,
Alright.
come back with more work. Oh my God.
Yeah, I think that
Never happens to
that
anybody
happens.
else. I know. Anybody else have,
Yeah, I guess.
have KubeCon comments?
Yeah, so there's a few things that I wanted to touch on. And then I will end with something that dovetails into what Keith added here as Gamma is more than just Gateway API, which is interesting. So yeah, some of the stuff, some of the conversations that I had, one I already added it previously as a like backlog topic for discussion, but had additional conversations with some of the folks who have been working on admin network policy, as the shape of that feels like it's solving roughly similar sets of problems to kind of what meshes need for auth-z, namely being able to default deny traffic across a cluster, and then being able to have some kind of granular allow list between workloads. So in their case, they're focused similar to network policy on like IP addresses. So this would be like looking at how could we do some sort of extensible design that could be compatible with that, similar to like parent ref the Gateway API uses, to be able to support, instead of like an IP address binding to a workload identity, such as we had earlier discussed, like service account as kind of like the low level fruit or like the minimum implementable thing for many meshes. We all kind of can do something with service account, and hopefully we could eventually broaden that to be able to extend to implementation specific things as well. So I know that a few different meshes have some use of SPIFFE certificates, whether that's for on or off cluster resources. I know AWS has IAM identities. So that's something that is very early discussions, but I'm hoping to get those folks more integrated with some of the Gateway API work that's happening and Gamma more generally. Because yeah, I think that if we can dovetail some of that work together, I think that could actually be a really nice way to start making headway on one of those other problem spaces that we've largely not addressed, but we focused mostly on routing for the initial phase of Gamma work. What else? Yeah, definitely good discussions at Contributor Summit. I think I'm trying to remember what else. The Gamma gathering that we did at Contributor Summit was particularly valuable. Just getting all these folks in one room to be able to hash out some stuff like that. So, and I think one of the other things that I'll hand over to Keith in a moment, but Gamma is more than just Gateway API. So one of the talks that I actually was in with Rob and Stephen Kit from Red Hat, so Mariner, and Laura Lorenz from Sig Multicluster was about kind of the intersections between Gateway API, Gamma, and the MCS API. So it was really interesting to kind of see.
So you were saying that was a talk, right?
Yes, that was a talk that I was in. Yeah. So I think one of the interesting things was seeing the show of hands across the crowd of who was managing multiple clusters in production. And it was the vast majority of the audience. So I think that definitely speaks to a point of intersection that I hope we can start to think about more actively and kind of incorporate into Gamma and Gateway API, and Rob's recent gap on trying to define how service import can be referenced by HTTP route in Gateway API and Gamma is definitely a first step there. So yeah, I'll hand it over to Keith now if you have more thoughts on kind of expansive type thoughts.
Yeah, that was a really good segue. So in that talk, there's a question of, like Mike said, who's using multiple clusters in production? Lots of folks raised their hands. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a follow-up question of who's using the MCS API.
And it was very few currently.
Very few people currently using that. And we talked here in the Gamma meeting in the past kind of about the chicken egg problem with MCS API, how there needs to be this MCS controller to do things, how the MCS API is still alpha. And there's an issue that says it just needs some conformance tests or some integration testing, but there's also user feedback on, and I think you touched on this in the talk, Mike, about the use case where, okay, what if everything is not namespace sameness? What if that principle is gone? You want to federate? There's not a ton of work happening there. And I was looking at some there's a doc that Sig Multicluster shared out as far as what they wanted to try to tackle coming next. And MCS API for Multicluster service wasn't a part of that. It feels as if the SIG has, for lack of a better term, moved on to other things, and that there is opportunity for people to drive it. Like the people in Sig Multicluster seem willing to help guide and shepherd MCS work, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of drive for the past couple of years to push it forward. And in speaking with some stakeholders for Microsoft's internal multi-cluster stuff, they noticed that there is, MCS is still alpha. They feel like there's not a lot of iteration speed there, and there's some hesitation, which don't really blame them for. Like if it's going to take 2 to 3 years to change things, it's hard for them to take a dependency on something upstream. And so if we're running off of a fork of MCS for our fleet service. So that was what started my brain thinking in this direction, that MCS sits in this kind of weird intersection between Sig Multicluster and Sig Network. It's dependent upon somebody to write some sort of MCS controller, and each MCS controller that's out there does things a little bit differently. I don't think there is a mesh today that has an MCS controller embedded. And between, we've had conversations about how the MCS model doesn't super align with how meshes tend to think about the world when it comes to who's doing the routing. Studying MCS, go ahead, sorry.
I was just saying, yeah, so there's a couple points. I think the closest thing to a mesh-like implementation that uses parts of MCS is probably AWS VPC Lattice. And I want to plug Liwen and Rob's talk from KubeCon. goes into some of the technical details of that a bit more if you're interested in diving deep and learning a bit more about that and how they're using.
You want to post a
MCS
link to the
API.
talk?
Yes, we can add a note to do that.
Yeah, it's a talk available on YouTube yet, or it's still?
Well, I mean,
I
even
think in
the
a couple
sched,
days. I don't know if it's up yet.
yeah, even the sched link would work, right? Because the recording
Yeah,
should be.
yeah, okay. I can put in the GitHub of our implementation. We have a lot of examples there. Yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
So basically, we use service import and service export, and the cluster set in our implementation is a federation. We have VPC ladders as the way of federate all the cluster. So the source of truth of every single cluster information endpoint, it's all managed by the VPC ladders. So each controller, each cluster is a local. So the controller do not have to know every single cluster except itself. And that's how we implement it. So the export, the key of the export is when you create a service and you want to export to VPC ladders, all you need to do today, we have an annotation, a special annotation to say, hey, this one is federated by VPC ladders. And then the controller, once we find out a trigger by a service export and annotate it with the VPC ladders federation, it will create a target group in VPC ladders. On the consumer side who want to use a service import, all it does is just say backend ref of particular name. This is a service import because the HTTP route is under the VPC ladder gateway class. So our controller understand it's going to look for a service import and it's going to go to VPC ladder to say, do you have this particular target group? And so in our case, service import, in addition to Kubernetes services, can be extended to anything, to VM, EC2, or even Lambda functions, EC2. So for the consumer, HTTP raw point of view, I'm just pointing to a VPC ladders target group as a service import. So that's our implementation.
Hey, thanks. That's super. That's super interesting. So on the Azure side, we do things more like the classic like hub and spoke model, where there's a single controller that replicates things to the other clusters. I believe that's how that works. So even there, right? You see that there's the difference between how the topology of the MCS controller, which is kind of the point of the spec, to not be too
Prescriptive.
Prescriptive of how you have to implement it. But I think even if you take MCS aside, in the Istio community, there have been some things we talk about where we would love to get like the Gamma community's opinion, because even though Gamma lives within Gateway API, this is like the only spot where we get mesh implementers and users from different meshes all together in one spot to talk about things. And so things like service mesh open telemetry conventions, semantic conventions. It's not, we've talked about dodging telemetry for a bit, but who else besides mesh implementation should drive that work? There is talk around, okay, how do meshes, as service meshes get deeper and deeper into the stack, where do we talk to the CNIs to come up with common interfaces for how meshes and CNIs could communicate and make sure that there's, where there's duplication, what's the interface? And then MCS.
That's kind of interesting because like Linkerd already functions with a variety of CNIs.
So does Istio.
So I kind of feel like there's already an interface. What am I missing here?
So specifically with like ambient, right? When
yeah, but whatever, ambient's irrelevant. We all know that.
I think John's going to come and try to explain it better than I do. But where I was going with that was that as ambient's got this utility component that looks similar to what a CNI does, and there is a conversation about making sure that when a CNI goes and does things at a different layer, is there a way for a mesh to do that same thing in a higher layer? There was the eBPF socket load balancing thing a while back that broke that breaks every sidecar based service mesh, right? How do we communicate with CNI to make sure that doesn't happen? Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just to give a concrete place where this would help Linkerd is, I know that you're familiar with the race condition on new nodes starting up. This could solve that, for example, because the primary CNI doesn't have that issue.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
So during KubeCon, I was talking to several people about some of these things, and it feels like Gamma is the place where we want to have people talking about this, but Gamma is again so focused, is very focused on Gateway API and specifically traffic concerns. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't gotten to like the off policy attachment is because it feels kind of different than other kinds of policy, and a lot of concerns in things like identity and stuff like that sits outside of classical Kubernetes. And so when we were starting Gamma, myself and a couple of others like went to steering to ask to make it like a working group mesh. And the Kubernetes steering said that you don't really need a working group for this. To collaborate with other SIGs, start as a sub project, see what you see how what we're able to accomplish, and then consider if a working group is necessary. And I think that maybe not immediately, but I at least see a lot of areas where having a full-on working group with where we're able to maybe have multiple meetings and get a wider audience would be beneficial to some of the things that we're trying to do as we try to help align service mesh and Kubernetes. We've been able to do a lot of good work in Gamma with that as our goal. I think we have the potential to do that in other areas besides just Gateway API and traffic routing. And I wanted to kind of bring that up to the group. That's one big takeaway from KubeCon. I wanted to see how the rest of the greater group feels about that.
I think it's a good idea. I mean, as far as I know, there is no other group that's trying to do cross-vendor meshy things. So I think we're kind of it. So yeah, sure, why not?
I think my immediate reaction to this is yes, that seems useful. I would be worried that it would slow the pace of actually getting Gamma to like an implementable state. I think be in favor of it as an additional space rather than like subsuming this existing one. That's my initial take though. Happy to hear other opinions.
I don't think I have a lot of opinion on that. Try it one way, see if, yeah.
I'm similarly inclined. For just to give everybody a sense in my head, I think I only probably move to try to do this once we feel like Gamma is implementable because of what Mike just said. Right? We want to do this job well first and then figure out how we want to go and tackle other things. But I think it's useful to start talking about and thinking about and have everyone here start thinking about other areas and other Kubernetes SIGs where we might find this kind of working group collaboration to be useful. For clarity's sake, the kind of criteria for a working group and as far as Kubernetes governance goes is does not own any code. It is usually for a set defined period of time with exit criteria. And I think there is, and it has to be cross-sig, multiple SIGs. The thing that kind of worries me from a governance perspective is the set time frame, because I mean, all of these issues and concerns, don't really, there's not really a set exit criteria where we'd be done. And so we'd be asking, I think, in a case in a reality where we went to ask for a working group, we'd be asking for an exception there, which steering I don't think would be super thrilled about.
Nah,
But
clearly we just need to have it be SIG mesh, and because you know, obviously the world doesn't have enough SIGs and we need more of those.
I think there might be an existing like tag mesh or something like that, like the CNCF group.
Really?
Maybe, but
there is a tag network. There's a tag network and a working group mesh within the CNCF tag network.
But also I don't know how active that is.
Yeah, it's not super active at the moment.
On June 1st, there was of 2022, there was apparently a CNCF tag network and service mesh working group deep dive. Any y'all remember that by any chance? The names on it are Lee Calcote, Ken Owens, and Ed Warnicki.
I know Lee, but yeah, that's the only name that I recognize off the top of my head. Lee was
It
involved
looks like
in
they
some
were
of
talking
the,
about
SMI stuff.
Yeah, it kind of looks like they were talking about SMI more than anything else.
Yeah, SMI was a pretty big focus of that tag working group. So maybe that's an alternative like place for this. I think my preference would probably be for a Kubernetes working group initially, at least, just because I think we've seen it with Gamma, the benefits of being closely aligned with the Kubernetes SIGs, and the kind of the cross-pollination that's able to happen there has been really great for us. So again, not saying to do anything now. I think it makes more sense to finish what we started with Gamma, get it implementable, be ready for feedback and things like that, and then start chasing this down. But that was kind of the big takeaway for me at KubeCon. So if anybody has any more opinions or thoughts here, feel free
I'll
to
throw out
say
one
them.
other thing on that front, which is that obviously we're talking about KubeCon, which is all about Kubernetes, but there's obviously also a lot of discussion about meshes that span Kubernetes and things that are not in Kubernetes, right? So yeah, like, I think everybody on this call could probably wave their hand on that one, right? Certainly we hear people
They're
ask us
welcome
about
to.
it.
Yeah.
Certainly we hear people hear people ask us about mesh expansion with Linkerd on a regular basis. Yeah, it's a nice, easy technical problem. Yeah. But that, Keith, maybe we start with the working and okay, this is going to sound facetious, but this time I'm actually being serious. Yeah, maybe we start with a working group and then end up changing it into a tag later on or something like that, right? I share your concerns with the time limited aspect of a working group because I feel like there's an awful lot here. Shane, I don't think I've lost sound. Somebody other than me say something.
I can hear Flynn.
Yeah, all good. I guess it's just you, Shane. Sorry.
Quick say something about Shane when I can't hear things.
I should have typed that, huh?
All right. Yeah, I guess like I definitely. Yeah. But this is a lot to think about. Yeah,
Oh,
I
come
guess
on, you didn't expect the KubeCon. You didn't expect that to be a short recap, did you?
No, we kind of a long rambling recap touching on a lot of different points. Yeah, I think the MCS stuff is interesting because I mentioned this briefly in my talk, but I think to a large extent it was an API that arrived before the end users were ready for it. And then there's some stuff like we've seen how conformance testing gateway API has been like incredibly helpful to facilitate new implementations. And that's something that MCS or SIG Multicluster is working on for MCS API currently. So some of that stuff I am optimistic about. And yeah, I think that we're starting to see that this is a problem that actual end users are trying to solve now. So I think that, and from prior discussions, it's mostly that the existing API is not expected to like go through a lot of churn. Like the like core resources feel like they're generally well designed and stable. It's a lot of the like behaviors and stuff in the caps where there's things that may need to, yeah, look, be considered for like mesh use cases as one. And this a lot of the API was designed to really service discovery use case. So yeah, there's some stuff like that. But I think that there's also definitely potential for, if people want to get involved, to drive multi-cluster solutions forward, whether that be like building on top of what exists in the MCS API today, or like figuring out anything new potentially to address like cross-cluster set relationships, which is something that we're particularly interested in. Whereas, yeah, I should probably get some of this into a document that is publicly readable at some point. But yeah, there's a couple of different multi-cluster use cases, and I think that we're starting to see end users care about them. And the existing API, like, it addresses a subset of those. So yeah, I think that we're definitely starting to see a more expansive use case of people going beyond a single Kubernetes cluster and needing solutions for that. So yeah, definitely interested in seeing where that goes and working with people to move that forward in a way that will hopefully work for all of us. It's time check. We've got about 15 minutes left. And should we, I think Keith, you added milestone triage. If we want to go through that briefly.
Yeah, that shouldn't take too long.
All right.
It terrifies me to hear that in this group of people.
Fair enough. I just managed to fix myself. So, Flynn, since you spoke up there, we'll start with your and Mike's issue.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Mike and I should get together and take a look at this again, because I am pretty confident it got completely knocked out of my head by KubeCon. How about you, Mike? Do you actually remember anything about where we were on this?
Yes. Yeah. I should basically like clean up my notes. So I've gone through like 3 revisions of this doc now. Keith and I started one several months ago. We basically put that on hold to try to explore, is a different UX possible that might be more friendly to like end user expectations. Flynn and I went through an exercise in exploring that, and I think the conclusion that at least I came to was, while we want the UX, well, there's a UX that we want, it is difficult or impractical to actually implement. And there are too many ways around it for it to be like required or expected. And kind of the long tail of where I'm getting to now is figuring out that defining a very particular way for where these boundaries must exist is feeling increasingly impractical, because so much of it is determined by internal implementation details of each mesh, such as like where proxies are being deployed. Like you can, you have the ability to do different things if you're deploying proxies as sidecars, or at a namespace level, or at a namespace egress level or at a cluster boundary. And those actually have a significant impact on routing decisions because of how you're selecting destinations. So I think I need to basically consolidate all of this into, there may be some variance here, and it is not expected that a given configuration will produce exactly the same routing behavior between implementations, but I think that that's going to be okay. Because largely we're not expecting people to switch between implementations. Like, as long as the boundaries are clear and the like way in which you use the spec is clear, I hope it's workable. So
And for
yeah,
yeah, for my part of all this, there's some stuff that I need to read and some discussions that I need to have with some of the other Linkerd folks. So I think what I'm saying here is hopefully I would like to say that I think it's realistic to get that documentation nailed, get that doc nailed down for the next Gamma meeting, but I think it's more realistic to say the one after that. You have an opinion there, Mike?
2 weeks sounds like a reasonable target for
Yeah.
me, because I am also going to have yeah, some limited availability.
I'm
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff that Mike is saying that I understand, and at the same time a lot of stuff where I am very, very concerned about the extent to which it will surprise people trying to use the stuff. So need to sit down and nail some of that down.
Yeah.
I feel like I did jinx myself because I'm wondering if, and maybe this is an easy answer, but I'm wondering if surprises at this stage aren't past, like,
Are inevitable?
okay. And yeah, inevitable is a good word. Like we're defining a set of patterns and trying to do something that has that doesn't exist currently. And so there are going to be limits, especially for this implementable milestone. There are going to be limits to what we can standardize.
One of the things that one of the guiding principles that has served me well in the past is to try to adhere to the principle of least surprise, right? If you go through and you put in a resource called HTTP route, then a user who knows absolutely nothing about this, creating an HTTP route, is going to expect it to route HTTP traffic. They're not going to expect it to have some weird knock-on effect where it does something differently with raw TCP or gRPC or, you know, whatever, right? If you're an application developer and you put in a route that says, I want this chunk of the URL space to get routed to my application, whether there's a service mesh or not, there's a set of things that you're probably going to expect to happen. If you're a mesh operator and you put in a route that you think is bound to something where your mesh will interpret it, there's a set of behaviors that you're going to expect to happen. To the extent that we can avoid completely shocking those expectations, that'll be a really, really good thing. Obviously, there are often implementation pressures that run counter to that, but that's the stuff that I'm thinking of here, is looking over some of these and being kind of worried. So yeah, but I think we can nail it down in the next couple of weeks and come up with something that we can all pick apart and heckle. And I will probably not be utterly ecstatic with whatever we come up with, but I think I can come up with something I feel like I can live with. So
that's kind of where I'm at. It's like, I don't like the conclusions that I got to, but it feels like it's
sometimes that's the best you can do, right? I don't really like this, but I think it's not completely unreasonable is not a terrible place to end up.
Exactly, yeah. So
It's not a
just trying to figure out
satisfying
like,
place to end up.
yeah, it's not, but it's like, okay, so what can we actually define? What behaviors can we actually expect? And trying to, particularly the thing I want to focus on is writing up like the user stories of, for a
Right.
given persona, how does this impact them? And how would they manage specific workflows if our configuration works this way? And I think that that's something where it is mostly workable, where because of the distributed nature of Gateway API, even if you don't have a gateway respecting producer config in Gamma, like you should at least be able to have the same team that owns that mesh service be able to author the HTTP route for the north-south traffic for their service. So that kind of separation there helps make it easier and more, I guess, palatable. So yeah,
Palatable is a good
there's some
word,
stuff
yeah.
like that. Yeah, I think that's kind of what we're going for, and trying to at least like get those written out more verbosely, which are mostly a pile of hacked together notes right now. So that's the status of where that is at, and yeah, hopefully 2 weeks from now again.
Yep.
Seems like, yeah, let's have that as a target to have something to share for broader dissemination and heckling, as Flynn has said. We've got two other issues.
I'm actually glad it's going to be in 2 weeks, just because I'm going to be out of office all of next week. So works.
Happy to be of service, Keith.
Same mostly.
Yeah. So.
All right, 2 issues left. We're out of time. Move test app into Kate's org. John?
Yeah, we should do that, but I haven't done anything on it in a while. If someone wants
Cool.
to pick it up, that would be great.
We decided this was going to be code and image, correct?
Definitely the image.
Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to have one but not the other. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Image is easy. Image is the easy one. Code depends on how. I mean, could we just take basically the Istio test app code / framework and put it in its own like repo under Kubernetes? Would that be sufficient? I think.
Yeah, it could be done.
What? Yeah, I think that works. Okay, I might be able to tackle that.
Yeah, I guess the question I have is like, is there organizational, administrative, legal things that need to happen on either the Kubernetes side or the Istio side to make this happen?
All the files that I'm looking at say they're Apache licensed and copyright by the Kubernetes authors already. So hopefully the legalese has already happened.
Yeah, I think their Apache should be fine to move.
And at this point, Istio and Kubernetes are both within the CNCF. So we're just moving things between projects in the same legal entity. So that passes the
That makes it a little easier.
limited legal sniff tests for me.
It could still be the case that there's, you know, code that claims copyright by Google or, you know, Tetrate or whoever, and then we would have to think about it a little bit further. But everything in John's initial PR looks like it already claims the Kube authors for copyright. So
Cool.
I'm thinking that already happened, which is good
Alright.
news.
And last one, Keith, clarify parent ref findings for mesh. I know this is the gap that you had been working on.
Yeah, it's pretty much done. Sorry, got sidetracked. It's pretty much like all the feedback has been addressed. I'd love for the folks to do the initial review to go through and give it another once over. Or anybody else who didn't get a chance to, please give it one more look through. But basically, this should help. It's just changing the initial 1426 get to be more explicit on what is being on kind of the qualifications for parent ref in Gamma. So
You're, yeah, your intention there isn't changing semantics. Your intention there is clarification, right?
correct. No semantics should be changed, I don't think. Just clarifying things that we either talked about here or indirectly or hand wavy. So if there's anything objectionable there, please let me know. Because it means that I'm not on the same page as people.
All right. Well, that sounds good. We are now out of time. So thank you everyone for the discussion
Thank you.
today. And yeah, take care and have a good rest of your day, y'all.
Likewise.